And with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first of this semester's UHI Islands Matter webinars. And this one is a fascinating development where we've got people from the Scottish Government and from other research institutes wanting to take part to explore the Scottish Government's research on island depopulation in Japan, led by Dr Jane Atterton, who's going to take over just shortly. So I'd like to welcome the attendees, and I'd like to welcome the speakers who are going to give us a very exciting start to this webinar series. And just a little bit about this. Dr Jane Atterton is the Manager and Policy Researcher in the Rural Policy Centre at SRUC. Sorry, SRUC, getting that right. And she and the others are going to talk about the research that they've undertaken for the Scottish Government on island depopulation in Japan. And they've been exploring some exciting case studies about depopulation initiatives, which we hope draw some lessons for the Scottish Islands. So very pleased for them to be here today to share this information. And just before I pass over to Jane, I'd just like to welcome those who haven't been to an INS webinar like this before, and to say there are others in the pipeline as well. So please look on the INS webpage for the other forthcoming Islands Matter webinars. And with that, thank you very much, Jane, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Great. Hopefully everyone can see those. Andrew, if you could give me a thumbs up or a nod just to cover. Excellent. Great. Thank you. So thank you, Andrew, for having us today to open your seminar series for this year. It's great. This is very much a team project, very much an international project, and it's great that we've got a few members of the team to present today. I think the other team members who are not presenting are also in the audience as well, so they'll be around to answer any questions as well and take part in the discussion. So thank you. I'm not going to do introductions simply for reasons of time. You can see our institutional logos along the bottom of the screen there. We're all connected and have worked together in various different ways before in various combinations, and I think really one of the most important things that this project has shown me is the value of having an international team of researchers based in the countries that you're studying, because otherwise you just don't grasp the sort of local context, the local nuances, and the local issues of language and culture that are so important to understanding when we're trying to do this international comparative work. And that's maybe something to come back to in the discussion. So very briefly, as Andrew said, this was a piece of work for Scottish Government. It was a small piece of work. It was mainly desk-based, although Chisaki, Sae, and Luke did some online interviews with people in Japan, particularly those working in some of the local case studies that you'll hear about. And it was very much an exploratory study, and in some ways raises more issues and more questions than answers, some of which I'm sure we'll pick up today, and hopefully that will inform future research in this area. So just briefly, what we're going to cover today, I'm going to hand over to Mike Andrews from Scottish Government in a moment, just to give a bit of a flavour of the policy context and the rationale for the project. We're then going to hand on to Luke, who's going to talk you through, I suppose, the Japanese context, Japanese islands, and the policies that are relevant to them. Chisaki and Sae are then going to each take one of our 4 case studies, so we'll talk you through 2 of the 4. Just again, very briefly, there are others that we just don't have time to cover today. And then if there's time, we'll finish with some brief reflections, I suppose, on the lessons learned for Scotland that I'll cover at the end. And then it's over to you for questions and discussion. So, Mike, I'm going to hand to you at that point just for a few comments on the policy context and the project rationale.
Thanks very much, Jane. Just double checking, can I get a hands up that folk can hear me okay? Is that work fine? Nice, cool, thank you. First time using WebEx in a very long time. So just by way of giving a brief overview of the kind of Scottish Government policy context and kind of what led to this work, just going to run through a few kind of headline features of our work that we are doing within the population team within Scottish Government, and again how that led into this piece of commissioned research. So it probably won't be a great surprise to many people on the call that Scotland's facing a number of long-term demographic challenges at the moment. We have an ageing population, a declining birth rate, an uncertain future in the context of migration, and spatial population imbalances as well. And many of our island communities in particular are experiencing acute depopulation and population ageing in dare I say, an almost exaggerated fashion compared to other parts of the country. So to tackle these and other problems, Scottish Government published our first national population strategy last year, which is overseen by a ministerial population task force comprising more than 10 of the Scottish ministers and cabinet secretaries. The aim of this work is overall to make communities across Scotland attractive places to live, work, bring up families and move to. But as part of the population strategy, we've committed to undertaking a range of international engagement to share knowledge and best practice and inform our own approaches through learning about what other countries are doing in the context of tackling demographic challenges. As part of this, we therefore commissioned this research project from the team at SRUC to better understand island depopulation in Japan and what lessons might be applicable in the Scottish context, because like Scotland, many of Japan's smaller and remote islands have historically and are continuing to experience acute levels of depopulation. The findings and recommendations that are set out in the report, we hope will have a number of practical uses for us as policymakers. Firstly, the findings may inform the development of the Addressing Depopulation Action Plan, which is due to be published at some point next year following ministerial commitment earlier this year. And the objective of that will be to enable population retention and repopulation across rural and island communities in Scotland. The report will also support the ongoing delivery of our National Islands Plan, which was launched in 2019. That plan is a policy framework aimed at improving outcomes for Scotland's islands, a key element of which is to ensure a healthy and balanced population profile across those geographies. And thirdly, these findings may open up new channels and facilitate kind of the opportunity for bilateral engagement between ourselves and Scottish Government and key Japanese stakeholders as well. And that's definitely an aspiration for myself out the back of this work as well. So I'm just going to pause there and hand back to Jane, but before I do that, I just want to say a great big thank you to the research team for the work undertaken, and really looking forward to hearing comments and reflections from those attending the session as we kind of move on with this work. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to move on to the next slide and hand over to Luke. Luke, give me a shout when you want the slide to change.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. Great. So thank you very much, Andrew. And I would really first like to talk to you a little bit about Japan's islands, their issues and some of the policies and initiatives and approaches to the problems of depopulation and aging that we can see across Japan. So firstly, Japan consists of about 6,852 islands. 6,847 are defined as remote islands, and of these, 416 are inhabited with a population of around 615,000, which makes up about 0.5% of the Japanese population. Due to the length of the Japanese archipelago, as you can see by these pictures, the climate varies quite considerably from the subarctic north in Hokkaido to the subtropical south in Okinawa. Traditionally, the primary sector was the most important sector of the economy, but there's been a shift towards services recently. However, the primary sector still, in comparison to the rest of Japan, is important on the islands. Often being remote, the islands are at risk of extreme weather and natural disasters, but they are also culturally, historically, and biologically rich. And while this richness is part of their intrinsic value, the islands are also strategically important as they mark out Japan's exclusive economic zone, which is the 6th largest in the world. Next slide, Jane. However, many of Japan's islands are facing an uncertain future. At a national level, Japan's population is aging and shrinking, and Japan's islands and remote areas are really at the forefront of this demographic change. Japan's remote islands have seen population declines of around 60% between 1955 and 2010, And the key drivers to this population decline are outmigration and more deaths than birth. There are, of course, a range of kind of tangible impacts of this falling and aging population, including abandoned schools and houses, as this picture you can see, abandoned houses here. And of course, there are less visible problems. As populations fall, people, and particularly elderly people, become increasingly isolated, and local traditions, practices, and heritage starts to disappear. Jane, that's okay. The issue of population decline has been apparent for a number of decades, and one of really the first policies in Japan that sought to explicitly address the issue of depopulation and regional decline was the Kaso Chiki law, which was introduced in 1970. Originally meant as an emergency measure that was time limited to 10 years, the Kaso Act was subsequently extended and amended multiple times. Kaso Chiki can be translated a depopulated area, and under the Kaso Acts, areas across Japan have been designated as depopulated. This designation is based on demographic and economic indicators, and over half of the Japanese municipalities are now designated as depopulated. So I've included some data on population levels in the different areas of Japan if you're interested on this slide. Depopulated areas are defined as defined under this act benefit from fiscal transfer mechanisms. Simply, they receive extra money from government, central government, as well as subsidies, and also what are called debt bonds, which are underwritten to the tune of 70%, again by central government. If it's okay to go to the next slide, Jill. The Kaso Acts really are a kind of a part of a history of kind of top-down and infrastructure-focused rural development initiatives in Japan. And as with the sort of modernist top-down approaches in the UK, these type of development policies have been critiqued for being environmentally and culturally destructive. However, more recently, there has been a shift in the Kaso Acts, with an increasing emphasis being placed on local independence, local resources, and the positive functions of remote and depopulated areas. Further, so-called soft projects have become eligible for subsidies, including projects related to education, culture, and medical services. However, Chang argues that the emphasis is still on hard infrastructure, which seems to really be supported by the data which you can see in this in the slide. And questions remain as to how the Kaso Acts might actually incentivize the status quo and unsustainable debt. And what I mean here really is that subsidies based on depopulated status potentially incentivize the maintenance of depopulated status, and the issuing of debt bonds can place municipalities into high levels of debt. Move on to it. Thank you, Jim. It's important to stress that the Kaso Acts are national in scale, but also apply to the islands of Japan too. A further example of a sort of national level policy that's applicable to the islands is the Regional Revitalization Strategy, which has, under the banner of towns, people and jobs, emphasized, amongst others, sustainable development, renewable energy, digital connectivities, AI, and automation. There are also island-specific policies, but these have historically, much like the Kaso Acts, been quite top-down in nature and focused on infrastructure, although again, there have been recent shifts towards a greater recognition of local assets and resources. Unfortunately, I don't really have time to explore these in any depth. However, I would like to kind of explore in a little more detail one aspect of a number of Japanese development policies. Across a number of these policies and development-focused initiatives and policies, including this, the recently amended Kaso Act and the Regional Revitalization Strategy, one can find reference to interregional exchange and the promotion of both permanent and semi-permanent urban to rural migration. And I would like to focus on really two kind of specific examples of this here, which are Chikiokoshi Kyo Ryoktai, try saying that after a few beers, and Kankei Jinko. So yes, sorry, Jane, next slide, please. So Kankei Jinko has been promoted under the Regional Revitalization Strategy. And this term can be rather unsatisfactorily translated as relationship population. and has been defined by the Japanese government as not permanent migrants nor tourists, but rather individuals or groups of people who make repeated visits to a particular area and who can contribute to local development in some way. Here, Kankei Jinko are understood to be on a spectrum of commitment, moving towards permanent migrant. As we can perhaps see in this graphic here, there's a kind of movement towards permanent migrant or permanent residence. Sorry, Jane, next slide if that's okay. It's clear that the conception of Kankei Jinko is evolving, and it seems to be part of a kind of shifting policy landscape that, particularly since COVID-19, has sought to encourage new and emerging forms of work, including telework or parallel work, not only for permanent migrants, but also for those looking to visit remote areas for the shorter term. Perhaps another example of this is the concept of workation, not only found in Japan, I would note, but here remote areas and islands seek to offer more relaxing and enjoyable locations for work on a temporary basis. Nationally, there is an estimated £600,000 to promote Kankei Jinko in 2022, but at a local level too, we see schemes aimed at encouraging temporary forms of migration, including the construction and establishment of purpose-built shared work facilities with internet access. Another national program that I would like to highlight is this Chikiokoshi Kyoryotai, which can be translated as Community Cooperative Support Initiative. Here, members, and they're predominantly young urbanites, receive a stipend of around £1,000 a month for a maximum of 3 years. And members of the scheme live in remote and island communities and take part in a range of activities aimed at promoting or preserving local culture, history, or nature. And in 2021, about 6,000 individuals took part in the scheme. Nationwide figures indicate that 63% of those enrolled in the scheme take up longer-term residence in their adopted location. Next one, sorry. Yeah, so this is my final slide, but it is, of course, not only at the national level which we're seeing initiatives and programs aimed at combating a population decline. At local level too, one can often find a range of initiatives and programs aimed at attracting new migrants and to facilitate in-migration. In many cases, these programs and schemes are either run by the local government or local non-profit groups. One example is the Empty House Bank. This is an example of an empty house bank with all the pictures of the houses. These schemes are essentially a list of under and unutilized houses and property. And this was basically enabled by a change in the law in 2014, allowing local municipalities to collect information on abandoned property. Here, local officials and others act as intermediaries between owners of abandoned or underutilized property and those looking to in-migrate. Cost of the property is often very low. Houses around £35,000 or below is not unusual. And in some cases, the houses are given away for free. These banks are often coupled to introductory services, which are basically essentially a guidance on living and working in particular areas, including advice related to social services, education, and so on. Indeed, some areas even offer experience type events or services where potential in-migrants can experience living and working in island and remote communities before moving. And this is an example of a kind of experience event, the blue flyer thing on the slide. There's now also national level websites and organizations which offer in-migration support and collate information on abandoned property nationally. However, Rausch in 2020 argues that these empty house banks don't address one of the key issues, which is that of employment, and questions if such schemes will attract really significant numbers of in-migrants. Anyway, I'm a little bit over time and I would like to leave it there, but I would like to hand over to my colleagues to discuss a little more concretely some of the approaches they have looked at.
Thanks, Luke. Chisaki, I think it's over to you.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Luke. Hello, my name is Chisaki. I'm going to introduce case study Amami Study Freelance Initiative. Amami City is located Amami Islands between Okinawa and the mainland. It is 2 hours flight to Tokyo and it's far from any big cities. There's no major industry. There are a few job opportunities in the private sector. Similar to the other rural areas, it has suffered from depopulation in recent decades. 1/3 of the population is over 65 years old. The birth rate is higher than other rural areas, but young people leave to big cities for education and work. Amami has a small but steady influx of migrants who are not from Amami but have come to live in Amami. Because of the beautiful nature and unique biodiversity, Amami Islands attract tourists, repeat visitors, and Kankei-jinko who come for long-term visits or small-term work. In the past 2 decades, Japanese society has endured a sustained economic crisis. Major companies has been through business restructuring, which has made much of the full-time working population redundant. This has led to different work patterns, such as dispatch specialists, particularly in the area of IT. By the time of the project started in 2015, Amami business owners had started using crowdsourcing companies to hire technicians, which brought freelancers into the project. Next slide, please. Okay. Amami project organization uses crowdsourcing companies to provide the freelancers with business opportunities, management workshops, and advice. Whether in migrants or not, the project fosters talents by providing skill training in the area of IT, craft making, photography, and writing in different subjects and media. The market venue and e-commerce platform to advertise and sell their products are arranged in cooperation with the guild communities. The picture on the top is the public ICT facilities for seminars, craft making, independent work, and childcare that is free or at a reasonable rate. The picture on the bottom is a store in the craft market where the individuals sell their products. Amami City also ran advisory and introductory services for new immigrants, such as funding and benefits, housing, and an introductory tour to the area. As a result, Amami Freelance Initiatives trained 202 freelancers, out of which 38 immigrated through the program by the end of 2019. The majority of the trainees are local, from independent business owners to many child carers and parallel workers, from high earning to supplemental income. Next page, please. Okay, so the first phase of the project, 2015 to 19, was a relatively low budget, using the existing resources, empty buildings, and infrastructure, and human resources. Grassroots approach, the project activities are tailored to the individual level and circumstances. It is convenient for child carers, mostly female members of the society, by enabling flexible work within their capacity. Even during the COVID pandemic, people could work and learn online thanks to the Wi-Fi broadband all over the city. The type of skill capacity development is also sustainable and independent from the retailers and large investment. Community integration is a complex issue intersecting with housing and neighborhood responsibility. Although many immigrants are attracted by the traditional village, the city and some communities are cautious about receiving newcomers. The project seeks to help incomers to understand local custom and integrate well. Income and life balance. There are some cases of high earnings, but most people it's hard to make enough money to live on from one job. They must make their living from multiple jobs. Even though having several jobs, there's not enough demand in Ireland's economy. So, during the initial stage of freelancing, it is often required to do business in person rather than online communication. One of the program participants who goes back and forth between Tokyo and Amami for work says, Tokyo pays my living, but I chose to live in beautiful Amami Islands. Amami is reasonable in price and house is spacious, which is secondary but important reason to maintain the life he enjoys. The local population plays a critical role in the project as well. Many of public officers, project experts, and the participants were born in Amami, left for education and work, and came back with skill and experience to contribute their hometown. Although there is no official statistics of returnees, more in-depth research on migration practice would contribute to a better understanding of their long-term strategy. Finally, I'd like to thank my informants, Resource Center, Amami Freelance, Amami Public Office, Scottish Government Population Team, and Japanese Island Project colleagues for cooperation and support. Thank you.
Thanks, Chisaki, that's great. Sae, over to you for our second case study.
Yes. Hi, I'm Sae. I'm going to introduce about high school attractive project on Nakanoshima Island. So this project was launched in 2008 to create an attractive and sustainable school and community to tackle the depopulation. The project site is Okidozen High School, which is the only high school in the Oki group of islands. In 2008, the high school was in danger of closing permanently because of the declining birth rate and the deteriorating educational environment. In response to this situation, town hall staff played a key role in initiating the project. They are working with teachers and coordinators from outside the island to try to make the high school more attractive. Next slide, please. So what they are doing. Firstly, the high school introduced community-based learning to the school curriculum, in which teachers aim to support the diverse ambitions and ability of each student and train them to be community builders who can be active both globally and locally. Then the town hires coordinators who are skilled in process of human resource development and places them within the school to connect the children, the teachers, and the local communities. In addition, they established Island Study Abroad program to welcome students from outside the island and even from overseas. And in order to organize the project, they have got financial support from national subsidies and funds. Also, in order to ensure the sustainability of the project, they are trying to make use of national tax program called Hometown Tax Donation Program, in which they can be donated by taxpayers from outside the island. Okay, next, please. So here is outcome and impact. As the graph shows before the start of the project, the school had only one class per year group and the number of students totaled 89 in 2008. However, by 2017, 8 years after the start of the project, the enrollment had increased and the school had 2 classes per year group with around 180 students in total. The high school has achieved a doubling of the number of students, and now 57% of students are from outside the island. This is unusual in remote areas of Japan. As for impact, there are increasing number of immigrants. Although total population of the island is still declining, but the rate has slowed. The project have also positive impacts on the local communities. For example, tourism has developed. This island is now quite famous and many people visit to see what is happening there. And also some local traditions have regenerated through the community-based learning. On the other hand, local and national policies have slightly changed. Since 2011, the local government has had the funds to encourage other high schools in remote areas of the prefecture to implement the high school attractive project. Furthermore, the national government has amended the law on the number of teachers in high schools to ensure that there is an adequate number of teachers even in small schools. However, the total population is still declining because most of students leave the island to get new jobs after they graduate. In order to tackle the challenge, they have recently started an internship and trial migration program for young people. They expect their children to return to the island and more newcomers to come. Okay, let me move on. Okay, so let me wrap up with the lessons learned from Nakanoshima Island. So first, the high school attractiveness project has taken root as a culture across the wider region rather than as one project in one location. So currently, this project has spread it to other parts of Japan, and now there are more than 20 schools to take place similar projects. Second, the importance of having a good mix of people from inside and outside the community. And in this project, it was reported that the involvement of people from outside the island had helped to bring in new ideas and challenge strong traditional ideas and the fixed relationships within the community. Finally, Nakanoshima Island is sometimes referred to as a miracle island, but an interviewee argues that the high school attractiveness project is not a success story, but a challenge story. So it is important to keep experiencing trial and error when running a project like this. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sae. I'm conscious of time, so just to finish very briefly in terms of some of the lessons that we sort of drew for Scotland. I mean, I think one of the things just to say is obviously, you know, there are huge differences between the two countries and huge differences within the countries in terms of their islands. But I think this project has really shown the usefulness of doing this international comparative work despite those differences. And there is much to be learned, and hopefully this can be the start of an ongoing dialogue. islands are hugely important, as Luke sort of alluded to at the start, for all sorts of different reasons, whether that's strategic or political or economic or culturally. So that's the same, the same is true in Scotland as it is of Japan and indeed elsewhere. Just secondly, I think one of the other things that we talked about quite a bit as part of the project within the team is, what are the goals of demographic focused policy interventions, and being realistic, I suppose, about those goals in the context of a shrinking population in Japan as a whole. Is it realistic to pursue repopulation of all islands, or maybe we need a more nuanced approach? What about managed decline? It's not very politically acceptable, obviously, but providing welfare support, managing change, does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy? And also, what are some of the wider implications of that around land ownership, land use, land reform? So some and in the context of different goals, whether that's degrowth or green growth or well-being, how do all of these things sort of fit together, and where are the policy tensions? Some of the other principles we've got on there, flexibility to enable local tailoring, engaging with local communities really meaningfully, I think are very general principles that we would all sign up to. I think one of the other things that struck me about Japan was perhaps a more positive attitude to aging. In Scotland, we tend to focus on encouraging young people and encouraging young families. And whilst that's obviously true in Japan, there is more of an openness, if you like, to encouraging older migrants as well as younger immigrants. And I think the other thing is around packages of support and introducing people to these locations before they move. Not just providing financial support, but wider support as well. And I think just finally, building on positive COVID-19 related shifts, people moving out of urban centres maybe offers a new opportunity for many of these islands. And there is the potential, despite those differences, to translate, if you like, some of these specific initiatives, whether it's to do with education projects or relationship population or community cooperative scheme, translate those very specific initiatives to a Scottish context. So the Empty House Bank, for example, the context here in Scotland is so different because of the price of land and the price of housing, but that matching service where local property is matched with people who want to move in and introducing migrants to local community members might be something that's worth exploring here. I can see lots of questions popping up on the screen, so I propose that we stop there and hand over to questions. Laurie Brinklow from Canada, I think you were going to come in with a few sort of reflections based on your own work in Canada. So maybe we'll hand to you first and then over to others for wider questions.
Sure. I don't want to take too much time because there's some amazing questions there in the chat. Basically here, I just want to echo what Jane said about the importance of doing this inter-island kinds of research here at the Institute of Island Studies at UPEI in Canada on Prince Edward Island. We've been harping on this for decades now, the importance of learning about our own island through the lens of other islands. So this is the perfect example of this kind of thinking. And I was recently at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association meetings talking about our work on quality of life. And this question about retention on islands and population decline was the one that brought the most discussion. It fits so beautifully with quality of life work and indicators of well-being. And so I'll just say quickly that yes, we too here on Prince Edward Island are grappling with the, although we have a population of about 160,000, and we have enjoyed the biggest population increase in the country, but our retention rates of keeping immigrants here is the lowest in the country. And so our government is looking to find out ways of why this is happening. So the Institute just recently did some surveys on leavers and stayers, trying to figure out why people were leaving and what makes people want to be on the island. And of course, most of us coming from islands know that intrinsically why we want to be on an island. There's just something about that islandness factor that attracts us, but can we actually stay here and make a good living and a living for our families? And it has to do with safety and family and the beauty and just that islandness. But we also need to be able to make a living and stay. And so the biggest issue that seems to have come out after housing and after healthcare and after those jobs the shortage of, good, well-paying jobs, meaningful work, is sense of belonging. And so there's something about Prince Edward Island and perhaps on other islands where we're finding it a challenge to have people feel like they fit and that they belong. And so that's going to be our challenge, I think, over the next few years, is trying to figure out ways of working with the community to enable people to be more welcoming and to welcome newcomers in and make them feel that they belong. So I'll stop there because there's just so much good chat in the chat room there, and but happy to answer any questions down the road, and you know where to find me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laurie, for your thoughts there. And it's a similar situation in Shetland. As you know, we have many discussions about these things. Okay, so I say there's quite a lot of questions there, some of which have come from me. So again, Jane, since you are the expert here and you know which of your colleagues to address these questions to, perhaps you'd like to look through them and pass them over.
Okay, I'm just catching up here. So, Andrew, you had a question about the house bank and damaging house prices. And I know I did see something from my colleague Oak at SRUC asking about issues related to second home ownership in rural and island areas in Japan. So a couple of questions around housing. I'm going to look at Luke, although you probably can't tell on the screen. Is that something you could kick off with, Luke? And maybe Sae and Chisaki, if you want to add anything, feel free afterwards.
I'll try my best. So of course there are areas of Japan where second house, that are popular for people to own second homes, and there are of course second home ownership across Japan. But my sense is that certainly in Japan, the second home ownership is not such an issue, and certainly does not drive increases in house prices as we may find in the UK and elsewhere. Yes, house prices are generally cheap in rural areas, and the more remote they are, the cheaper they are generally. So as I said, it's not uncommon to find houses for £35,000 or less, in $50,000, say, across rural areas. So in that sense, I don't think there's such an impact of second-home ownership that you may find on, for example, the Isle of Mull, which I was on recently, was one of the big issues that they had highlighted. Hope that answers the question.
Sae or Chisaki, feel free to add anything. No pressure to if you don't want to.
No, I'm great. It's, I think it looks said almost, yeah. All I want to say, yes.
Cool. In that case, Sae, just to come to you, there was a couple of questions about the high school attractiveness project specifically. So Andrew asking what age are the high school students, and I think also commenting about the possible applicability to Shetland, and also I've lost it. Laurie asking about the community-based learning that's been added to the curriculum. What sort of things are being learned, and how do they contribute to high school numbers increasing? So Sae, do you want to have a go at those, and others feel free to chip in as well?
Yes, thank you. So the first question is about age of high school students. So here in Japan, high school students are from 16 to 18. So, and yeah, normally most of high school students go to school from their home, but as for the island study abroad program, students from the outside the island, they're living in dormitory, and then they are independent, and then they try to be involved in the community on the island. So in the school, community-based learning is, the theme is very diverse. So it depends on the seasons, or it depends on the what kind of resources are there on the islands. So, for example, they experience the fishery, so they learn about the traditional way to some fisheries, and then basically the main the fisheries is the declining as the economy. So they are trying to make some ideas how to revitalize the local economies or local fisheries with the local people. So it's very unique program. So then through this community-based learning, they've got many skills to utilize when they graduate. So I think it's one of the reason why some students want to enter the school from the outside the island.
Thanks, Sae. I've picked up a couple of questions there from the chat that I'm going to fire at Luke, I think. One is around Erica's question around national policies for islands, or are these designed and implemented locally? And there was a further question from Ian, I think it was, around land ownership and tenure on islands, which I know is something we did talk about briefly. Can I go to you, Luke? Other research team members, feel free to jump in as well.
Sure. I'm sorry, remind me of the first question.
So the first question was Erica from Scottish Government. Does the government of Japan have national policies for islands, or are these designed and implemented locally?
Sorry, yes. So there are national level island specific policies, and these are the Remote Island Development Act, and there's a number of other supplementary acts as well that target specific remote islands. The history is rather long. These, again, as I said, are quite, they're much like the CASO Act, there's a kind of history of, they also replicate this kind of top-down model, often focused on infrastructure, improving kind of, infrastructure for living, communications, also transport and industry as well. And there have been shifts recently under these, there have been shifts, again, kind of moving away from this very kind of top-down model to kind of focusing a bit more on local assets and local resources over the last, over the last 10, 20 years or so. I think this kind of nicely links into a question that I think Andrew actually asked about in the context of falling populations. Do islands matter? And part of the rationale behind these island-specific contexts, the island-specific policies, is that these islands are strategically important for Japan as they mark out their boundary, basically. And I'm conscious I'm being recorded, so I want to be a bit, but there is, there are some disagreements about borders in that region of the world, and these islands do kind of map out or kind of form the boundary of that border. So for Japan, they are very strategically important, and that's part of the reason or part of the rationale is to maintain that sort of boundary. So apart from the kind of intrinsic value, culture, history, heritage, all of that, they've also we have this. Strategic importance.
Thanks,
Sorry,
Luke.
on the second question, the land tenure.
Yeah.
I'm not. I really, that is is kind of beyond my knowledge really about land tenure. From what I understand, it doesn't differ wildly from the rest of Japan. I think it's it's just private ownership of land. It's not sort of owned by lords or anything like that. I think it's kind of normal sort of land tenure system. But as I said, that's really getting to the extent of my knowledge, I'm afraid, and I wouldn't want to comment much further on that.
Thanks, Luke. There's a little bit of discussion in the chat there about older immigrants, and I know someone was asking about examples of globally of managed decline of islands, and Simona's responded there in relation to her research focusing on older people. Just to say as well, our report was published yesterday in full on the Scottish Government website, so the link was on our final slide there, but I've also put it into the chat. And just to go back to the national policy question, sorry, we've got a sort of review of how these policies have evolved over time in the report for if anyone wants more information on that. Chisaki, there was a specific question about the Freelance initiative, and was it targeted at specific age groups? Which I've now lost, but I think that was the gist of the question. Can I hand that one to you?
Can't see which question it is. Well, it's not that no, it's not age specific. Any age you can come in, but it's actually most of them is 32 onwards. It's the 40s, 50s, and then a lot of them are family that used to work in big cities and then come into the Amami Islands and then join the project. Yes, and then like I said at the end of the report, and it said there's no official numbers for the returnees, so you can't tell how many people are coming actually born in Amami and coming back to Amami. So this is an interesting point, that what is the attractiveness to return to Amami for the U-turn, the so-called is a U-turn, that's born in Amami and then coming back to Amami. So that's an interest, and there's a space to study more. Yes, so it's a generation. It does matter a lot. It does matter, since for the older generation, they're going to the big city for the education and work, but they're coming back to look after your older parents. So aging is not necessarily, as you said, Jane, it's not necessarily negative thing. So you have a parents, you come back to look after parents, and then you find work there. So that's I don't say this applies to all communities and rural communities, but I think it's in Amami, particular Amami city is I see the trend of it.
Thanks, Chisaki. Again, lots of really interesting comments and chats, and people drawing on different examples in the chat there. Just to pick up on Philip's question, maybe again one for Luke. I don't know. He's asking about how existing islanders. Sorry, no, I've lost the question again. Oh, they keep jumping around. It was to do with the shift away from infrastructure investment. Was it? Yeah, sorry, I've got it. Was it because that didn't work, or didn't help stem depopulation, and were there any negative impacts from that infrastructure investment as opposed to the sort of softer development that's
that's a great question, so thank you. I think really, as with the kind of top-down sort of modernist approaches, as I said, in the UK and elsewhere, in Japan too, they have been sort of critiqued for being in many ways quite destructive environmentally. So if you want, there's a book called Dogs and Demons in Japan by somebody called Care, which is a great critique of kind of the Japanese development model, and particularly Care rails, sort of really strongly criticizes this top-down infrastructure focus, which he kind of sees as sort of carpeting Japan in concrete. And that, I think that critique certainly spurred these, certainly helped spur these shifts in sort of the development approaches. I mean, they are also expensive. They are also quite, infrastructure is quite expensive. Japan has one of the largest debts in the world, I think, to GDP. So that could certainly would be weighing on politicians' mind, I would imagine. But, despite this kind of emphasis on sort of soft projects like education and so on and so forth, you know, infrastructure spending is still, and infrastructure as a form and sort of end of development in itself is still sort of the paradigm, I would argue, within Japan. It hasn't shifted so hugely, really. So while while I would argue that yes, we're starting to see slight shifts in the kind of approach, I mean, the dominant paradigm is still often quite, you know, hard infrastructure focused, really. I mean, do Sae or Chisaki, please feel free to correct me, but that would be my view on that.
Thanks, Luke. Andrew, I'm conscious of time. We've hit 1 o'clock. There's a great question there from Erica that we haven't tackled, which is how existing islanders feel about initiatives, especially financial ones, directed to new islanders. Are there tensions? I don't know. Are we going to get cut off, or can we keep going?
We have time to answer that one, and I think the basis of that would be the £50,000 that was offered to people to come and live in the Scottish Islands, which sounds like a fantastic idea. Apart from the fact that the locals thought, hang on a minute, why are they going to get £50,000 to come and live amongst us? Give us the money and we'll spend it in a much better way. See, Erica, yes, smiley face. I thought it was a good idea, but there was a bit of a sort of fight back against that. So is there anything similar in Japan? And that could be our last question.
Do you want me to take this quickly?
Go for it, Luke, yeah.
Yes, so there is, recently they've just offered, I think people who live in the 23 special wards of Tokyo are eligible for relocation grants. Depending on whether it's a business or just relocation, it can vary quite a lot. I think, yeah, I can't remember the exact figures. I think it's 1 million yen or 3 million yen, depending on which one you do, which is about £6,000 to £12,000, I think. Are there... I personally haven't heard, this is quite a new strategy, a new kind of policy over the last couple of years. I personally haven't heard of any kind of disagreements about this, although I'm sure there will be some questioning as to why migrants from Tokyo would be eligible for grants, while Sae's nodding, so that's good, obviously an agreement, while people from Tokyo are eligible for grants, while maybe the local community does not. So, I mean, I'm sure that may well be an issue, and it's an interesting question that I will definitely have a look at in a bit more depth and see if I can find something on it.
Well, thank you very much for that answer, Luke, and thank you everyone for your fascinating contributions. It's been a really thought-provoking session, lots to take away from this, not least the fact that such interesting research is being undertaken, and it's been great to tap into it. So if you're looking for island-based researchers for further research, you know where to look. We're based in Shetland, Orkney, and the Western Isles, and also in the Inner Hebrides as well. UHI covers a large area. But your example of learning from Japan and seeing if there are lessons that can be applied in Scotland, as Laurie was saying, is a vitally important thing, and is actually the one of the main reasons for these webinars, that we want to learn from you. So thank you very much for spending time and explaining all the excellent research that you've been undertaking, and I'm sure we'll be able to follow up on these and discuss these things in due course. So thank you very much, everyone, for your contribution, and enjoy the rest of your day. I will now stop the webinar. All the best, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.